Cade Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book. And this week, I'm sure most of you have heard me kind of hinting at this. Our book is A New World by Whitley Strieber. This is video number 1. This is sort of a sequel to The Key. And I felt like it was important to continue the conversation. And in this book, he does elaborate quite a bit. It was written in 2020, quite a long time after The Key was written, or the event of The Key happened. So he expands on a lot of it. Some people were telling me that they felt The Key was kind of dark, and indeed it was, because Strieber himself was unsure. He hadn't processed everything yet. But since that book, he has evolved in his relationship with whatever these visitors are. And this book talks a lot about that and shines more of a light on it, is perhaps less dire, I guess. So, and I do want to apologize ahead of time because I read this really quickly and I took the notes really quickly because I just really wanted to do it this weekend. So my handwriting is virtually indecipherable, and I'm going to be struggling here. And I think I probably wrote fragments of sentences in my hurry, and they may not. So bear with me while I parse what this mess is. So, A New World by Whitley Strieber, and from 2020, with a foreword by Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, Kripal. I hope I said that right. And Dr. Kripal describes this as a book about a new supernatural world in which communication between the living and the dead is the new reality and has a new intensity. It's no longer just on the fringes of metaphysics. It's going to become a reality for everybody. He says we're going to go from physicality to some other new superphysical dimension, that the veil will fall, and that time and evolution don't work the way we think that they work, and that our understanding of all of this stuff is really rudimentary. We don't really have an understanding. We barely have a grasp on most of it, and this book's going to help us move in the right direction. They envision a time of increased sensory abilities and parapsychological abilities, and they do run in genetic lines, and it has to do with that whole theory of the electromagnetic plasma body that surrounds us, because our body is simply a vehicle. And he extrapolates, Dr. Kripal does, as does Strieber, that UFOs, they postulate, are actually vehicles for the souls of these visitors, that there's something larger, that UFOs and metaphysics are kind of related. So we need to understand our body as a vehicle, a temporary portal into another dimension, the three-dimensional world, and our timeline. And we use our body to connect with that. And we, who we really are really outside of the body. So this new, page 1, and I already can't read. This new evolution requires us and our participation for it to totally take shape and appear. This is not just going to happen automatically. And it depends on us for actualization and appearance, as opposed to our continually distorting and camouflaging things and them needing to keep secrecy. It depends on how we interact with the presences of our cosmic environment. It's going to define what happens next. So these choices that we have, they include how or if we read this book. Which sounds, like a naked attempt to get you to buy the book, which is why I'm synopsizing it for you, because it's the ideas in the book that matter. So we make a choice to be aware of this information. That Strieber firmly believes that this is an urgent communication from the visitors. So how you truly interact with the book, how you interact with the visitors, and the metaphysics of it and the idea of contact, it depends on you, and the reality of what occurs depends on us. So, they're maintaining that humans are primates, but they're also something other. And okay, so and the real importance here is seeing beyond just past human institutions that have made it so hard for us to grasp the truths, that they've interfered with it. Present day academics, their academic beliefs are sacred cows. And the big one is naturalism, the idea that only natural laws and forces are at play, and that the ones that we've defined are the only things that operate in the universe. And so that's naturalism. And also sacred cow is materialism, that we're in a 3D physicality. And scientism, what we think we've discovered and what we think we understand is all, that there's nothing unseen and inexplicable. They don't know supernatural stuff. So as a religious scholar, this is Dr. Cripple who wrote the foreword, he was taught that everything human is conditioned relative to local and material reality, that it's a function of history, it's a function of society, and there's no super here. There's nothing beyond that. So the example he uses is the mythology of sky gods who were inserting crystals into shamans to communicate and teach. And there is that actual belief in some mythology that gods from the skies came down and inserted these crystals to broaden the knowledge and understanding of humanity. Well, it's kind of what Whitley, Strieber, and a lot of other people have say they've experienced. He has an implant in his ear, which we'll discuss later. Really there. They got pictures of it. And he says, okay, the whole story of Ezekiel's chariot in the Bible. And I summarized his whole discussion of it with, come on. You really think there was a burning chariot and burning rotating wheels and stuff going on in the sky? And no, there was something much less well understood going on. And then the whole notion of ghosts and spirits and spectral beings, they've always been with us. Why do we keep maintaining that they're not real? They're different, but they're real. So Kripal has interacted with Anne Strieber. Anne Strieber is Whitley Strieber's wife. She died, but he's interacted with her since. He's seen things at night in Strieber's room that he can't explain. And they've changed him. They've had a dramatic impact on him. He says that invisible beings interact with humans, and humans are superhuman and don't know it. That the history of religion and societies and cultures all over the world hint at it, don't like to accept it, but they hint at it. And after contact, after meeting up with any of these entities, it will change a person's whole understanding of our history and society and our role in reality. He suspects that they are us. And they're not gods, they're not religion, they're not sci-fi, they're not alien spaceships, what that means. They're not technology. All those things are inadequate to explain what they really are. And until we are in the new world, we become the new world, we're not going to know. We have to wake up before we'll really understand. So this book analyzes a lot of that, parses it, tries to figure it out. It's really interesting. This is a lot of speculation. So chapter 1, the mystery begins. Strieber had his close encounter on December 26, 1985, which led to him writing the book Communion about the visitors. And I'm sure it's hard to avoid being familiar with the basic story behind this, whether you've read the book or not, because there was a lot of snarky media attention about it. The picture of the alien gray that is so familiar that it's just become ubiquitous, that was first introduced on the cover of the book Communion. It's what Strieber saw. But he says since 2000, and they've, by the way, continued to interact with him, but since 2015, the nature of this contact has, as he puts it, exploded in richness. It began not pleasantly, violently. They were doing medical experiments on him, and he got injured, and he was terrified. And his wife convinced him. It happened in their remote cabin in Maine or New York, I can't remember, East Coast. And his wife talked him into going back. He didn't want to ever go back because she believed that there was more to it than just little gray men. And he was forever grateful that he did. Because anyway, it changed him because he learned a little bit how to communicate with him instead of fighting it. How to communicate, and he's learned from that, and he's learned how to protect himself from that. It's very interesting, and he hopes to teach others through this book. So his encounter, he woke up in the middle of the night to big-eyed insects and stocky blue trolls. Now, the name that they use is kobolds, which was a medieval name for little blue miners in Bavaria, and I can't help but thinking, he doesn't say this, but I can't help but thinking of those little blue Smurf cartoons. That's how they're described. Miners actually saw these creatures claim to have seen these creatures in the tunnels under Bavaria. And sure enough, this is sort of lore, local lore, but sure enough, they've discovered these inexplicable tunnels in the area in Bavaria. Anyway, this event happened where he was like a trapped animal and got injured, and it was freakish and it was awful, terrified. And the next morning he woke up with a vague memory of what? Like an owl? Remember, owls are often kind of a cover memory. So he realized that it wasn't possible that it would be an owl just because of where he was. He discovered he had an injury on the side of his head. He had internal injuries, and he was very shaken by the whole experience. So he had to admit that something had happened, and he was reluctant to tell his wife. He kept this to himself for more than 6 weeks. He was afraid she would think he was nuts and want to divorce him. He felt responsible for her and for her son, and he didn't want to give in to the luxury of just having a complete mental collapse, which is what he really wanted to do. And he feared that he would become psychotic, or maybe had already become psychotic. But he had physical injuries. So see, he went to a doctor behind his wife's back and had neurological tests to rule out epilepsy or abnormalities in his brain. And he went to a psychiatrist and he had psychiatric tests, and everything came out normal, except he showed indications of severe stress. So he finally just submitted to the fear of what his memory was, that he had been taken onto a UFO by aliens and experimented on. Now remember, this is very early 1980s. This is not a common point of discussion in popular culture. How could he actually say that out loud to anyone and not find himself locked up, So he finally risked telling a friend of his whose parents had, it turns out, unbeknownst to Strieber until he told his friend, his parents had seen the same little blue men in their yard in upstate New York. And it was an enormous relief that when he realized there were other witnesses. They'd seen the gray aliens, they'd seen the little blue men. So one night after his son was asleep, he sat his wife down, and she admitted to him later she was afraid he was going to ask for a divorce. But when he told her what was bothering him, she started to laugh. And she said, "Oh, thank God. I thought you were going crazy." That was a great reaction. She said, "Well, I always wanted an interesting life." And this began their journey together of discovery. He wanted to sell the cabin, He was just appalled. She wanted to stay. She wanted to stay and see what might happen from this. She had a feeling that there was more to this. And his curiosity finally overcame the fear. And of course, they didn't live there. I think they lived somewhere like near New York or Manhattan or somewhere. And they traveled there on holiday and on weekends and stuff. So they decided to continue to go back, and he tried to get his courage together and went for walks alone in the wood to let them know that he was willing to meet with them again without violence. He put that out there. He knew that the injuries he had were caused because he was flailing around in panic like a trapped animal. But he was too curious not to do it. It was too remarkable of a situation. Anne told him that humans are too young for beliefs. We need good questions. It was arrogant to have, I believe, XYZ. So we have a nasty habit of believing in things that we really don't understand. And we end up killing each other over that. So this book is not about belief. It doesn't believe anything about this stuff. He says he's got events to report on, and it's an inquiry in how to communicate with a presence that seems to have been with us throughout history, if we take our history seriously and don't write it off as mythology and lore. But he said the nature of this interaction has changed since World War II. They are seeking to become more central to humans, and he thinks he knows why. They've told him why. Because we're killing our planet, and they don't want that. We're going to drive ourselves into extinction if we're not careful. They want to communicate with us, but we are so profoundly different, and this communication thus far has pretty much been impossible. Strieber decided to dedicate his life to learning how to communicate with them. So let's see what he has to say about that. The visitors have been very clear to me. Unless we can communicate with them in a rational, practical, and effective way, they can't help us. Our visitors stand ready to help us face the jeopardy we're in, and even aid us in solving the problems we're facing. The degree of their involvement depends on the degree to which we're able to face them and understand what they have to offer to us. For reasons that are going to become clear over the course of my story, this is not going to be easy. Far from it. Making sense of the relationship will be the greatest intellectual, emotional, and spiritual challenge that mankind has ever faced. If we're able to succeed, though, we're going to experience a vast increase in the range of human understanding. Truly, we're going to enter a new world. So he said religions have incorporated these alien creatures, the visitors, into their systems. Angels, devils, demigods, all those different entities. Christians see angels and demons. Muslims see jinn, like genies, jinn. In Northern Europe, there's all the talk of the fairy folk, So most complex cultural and social groups have been strongly influenced by these things, and the personal challenge is how to integrate that into your worldview. And unfortunately, government secrecy has impaired our ability. There's this veil of secrecy, of disquiet and confusion and fear from leadership. It's thrown the entire human species off balance. It's been the biggest mystery we have for the last 70 years. And it's not rational to deny that they're here, because so many people have had these encounters. They can't all be delusional. Well, I suppose they can, but what does that say? So it's not rational to deny it, and it's so complex. It's a huge intellectual challenge. It's beyond almost the capacity of our little pea brains to comprehend what's going on. Small groups of scientists know about this and are working on it. He knows this for a fact. He names a couple of them throughout the book, and there are others that he has been asked not to name, but there is knowledge of this. And most scientists and academics are left out. There's a state of enforced ignorance, and it's denial and it's indifference in society as a result. Experiencers are on their own. There's no help with understanding or coping emotionally with this. And the potential of this is lost. The potential it provides is lost in confusion, in confusion and modern folklore. Sorry, I couldn't read. I'm on the edge of the, kind of writing on the edge here. So the visitors are in control of disclosure. This is not something that the human government has any control over, which I thought was interesting. In fact, I want to talk to Denise about that. Let me mark that statement. It's not going to be up to us. It's going to be up to them. They'll decide when they will reveal themselves and when to integrate into our lives. They're subtle, thoughtful, careful. They know we would react badly if it was made official. They're powerful beyond conception. There's no way they're going to be defeated by our military, which is nonsense to even consider it. And that would be the totally wrong approach, and they know that's the approach that humans would take. We don't want to go to war. They don't want to go to war. Contact has the goal of deeper sharing and communion. And it feels threatening and can be violent in their approach because their context, their reality, their frame of reference is completely different. And we are just pathetic little inept creatures by comparison. Think about, okay, this may not be a completely adequate comparison, but think about Nobel Prize winning biologists and laboratory rats. That sort of thing, that sort of disparity. So there is potential for a reciprocal relationship, something that we don't always really think about, I don't think. But we'll have to have a leap of understanding to make this thing a success, setting aside our fear and setting aside our resistance. We devalue ourselves and don't realize that we have been entirely too passive about all of this. This is an opportunity and a potential exists for great things. But they're not our pals either. That's the important thing. They don't fully share with us because we're so unpredictable. We need to engage with them and increase our consciousness. This is an opportunity to increase our consciousness. We're talking about something, we're not talking Star Trek. You know, we kind of are, but we're not talking Star Trek. We're talking something on the metaphysical plane, something on the spiritual plane, because the spiritual, metaphysical, and the physics are all the same thing. So we need to know and see more of where we really are, what we really are. You know, the kingdom of heaven is within. That it's all connected to this. The visitors are an example of evolution, becoming a conscious mind. That's a big wow. That's really something, one little sentence. That's a remarkable thing to think about. And there are caveats. There are things we need to keep in mind before we ever move forward with this. For example, pre-Columbian cultures, when they met the Spaniards had high tech. They had armor, weapons, horses, gunpowder. But they also were morally deficient. They were part of the Inquisition. They were superstitious. They had a brutal, fanatical attitude towards other cultures. They destroyed native cultures. They subjugated and enslaved many across North America. Many European countries did exactly the same thing. And only now are these native cultures, these indigenous cultures, showing even a spark of recovery. And it's been hundreds of years. Most probably never will. And these visitors warn that much the same thing could happen to us without necessarily the brutality. They're not going into it with that kind of brutal thing that the Spaniards had. But the loss of culture and self is entirely possible. And why is that? Let's look at it. This warning has been placed at a site where advanced artifacts were left behind and from which scientists have been recovering valuable materials for years. The reason this particular site was chosen by the visitors has not been understood so far, but it can be. And its warning should be heeded carefully at every level of our society as the visitors emerge. So now we can all speculate where that is. I'm thinking Egypt. Just speculation. So the Aztecs tried to explain the arrival of Cortez as Quetzalcoatl. And they ignored the fact that the Spaniards didn't speak the Aztec language. That was just a little thing. And within 50 years, 90% of them were dead. And the other 10% were slaves. The Inca were taken over by Pizarro. And between 1532, 200 Spaniards, in 1532, 200 Spaniards defeated 6,000 Inca. They just didn't know what to think about Pizarro. And they revered them in large part because of their advanced technology and the myths that existed in their culture. And they compared themselves to them, found themselves wanting, lost their sense of self-worth, and the culture died. They disappeared with all their knowledge. The Aztecs did what we're doing, trying to fit these visitors, these newcomers, into pre-existing beliefs to explain the inexplicable. And the Aztecs were helpless, and we're helpless too. I'm not doing this to freak everybody out. It's just reality. It's reality, and reality is incomprehensible and scary. So here we go. So our scientific and intellectual communities are reacting with confusion and denial and silence. Superior technology makes indigenous cultures feel inferior. They abandon their own culture and beliefs and are living in a debased remnant of the former culture. That's happened over and over and over again throughout human history. And what's to say this is not going to happen to us? Because the same scenario is being set up. And as usual, we have not learned from the past. There is a way to deal with this. They're highly technological. They have a completely different view of reality. They're not just technologically more advanced, they have a completely different way of seeing reality, and when we first confront it, we're going to see them as being in possession of godlike powers, breathtaking insight, and seemingly unlimited scientific knowledge. They will appear this way not because they're more intelligent, but rather because of the different way their minds work. They are not more intelligent than we are. Not at all. They're more experienced, and their experience is fundamentally different from ours. We must not elevate them above what they are, but seek to meet their strengths with our own in the most meaningful and mutually enriching ways that we can find. I think that's a profound statement. They're not better than us. They're different from us in certain ways. But there's every reason to believe that we are a more compassionate, emotional, empathetic, and ethically evolved species, which we're going to continue to get into. They're so powerful, it's going to disempower our scientific and intellectual communities. They'll be made worse by the fact that they can't communicate. They've refused to try. They've turned their heads away. And the goals of this book are to get people to see that there are ways to communicate, that we have things that these entities value and need badly. And there's a great trade-off in offer here for us. They don't want to invade or enslave or destroy our freedom or take away our self-worth, because if they wanted to do that, they could have done it in a second, a long time ago. They think highly of us, And they consider that what we have to offer is valuable. And this book is a communion with them, because there's a deeper level of sharing possible here and not exploitation. We have what they want and they have what we want, and they recognize that we can work together, but they don't know how to communicate with us because we're stupid. Not stupid intellectually, resistant. And we don't even know what it is that we have to offer, but we're going to get into it. So since the early 90s, he said, he's not really been much in the public because he was so much scorn and ridicule piled on top of him. But he said that his relationship with the visitors grew and evolved and turned into a rewarding kind of companionship. But it wasn't easy. It's an interesting process. So August 11th, 2015, his wife Anne died, and she got sick. She died. She had a lengthy sickness. But his relationship with her continues because these visitors have taught him that death is not final and how to communicate with the dead. He and his wife wrote a book, The Afterlife Revolution. They wrote it together after she died. We're going to have to read that. So he wears both of their wedding rings because he says they're still together. And they may only have one physical body in this three-dimensional world, his, but their souls are still together. He says this idea is heretical in our society because we're blind to our souls. We're blind to what we really are. There's so much resistance. I just throw this out, I had family here this last weekend, and we were outside having a barbecue, and I was describing a book. I'm always describing the books that I've been reading, and I won't name names, but one of my very close family members mentioned something about of the electromagnetic body around you and your soul, your spirit. And he looked at me and goes, do you really believe that? Because, in the past, when this person first got to know me, I was pretty agnostic and still not religious. And still, I'm into the plasma physics of the whole thing and hermetic principles of living. And we've never discussed this. I haven't discussed this with my family, and they all, when I mention these things now, they think I've gone off the rails. And you can see it really upsets me. I think it's good for them to hear this, and I'm more than happy to oblige. Anyway, this is heretical in my family and in society because we're blind to who we are, that our souls are just an extension, part of nature. It's not supernatural. It's not woo-woo. So they live in that world, and spirits and the visitors, they live in that world. They only visit the physical world. And the reality of the soul, it's much larger than just physical reality. It's something that's barely comprehensible to most people. And it's nothing like we've imagined in our consciousness. We are consciousness. Our physical world is embedded in a much larger, richer reality. We deny it because we can't prove it, and we need proof of everything. And we fear the dictatorship of religion, and I think that's a really important fact. People do not want to push back against established religious belief. It's not the soul of religion, though, but something very different, much more real, and in the end, much more obviously part of nature. Nor is it really separate from the body. A living being is rather a continuity. The borders of a human being are not found along the edges of the flesh, but rather within us, where there are depths that we've forgotten but can regain. And if we are to survive much longer as a species, must regain. The kingdom of heaven, right? It's a metaphorical thing. The visitors want to help us refocus and find this new world, and with it, permanent physical survival and the conscious extension of ourselves into a larger reality. All we need to do is to learn how to communicate with them. That's all. It's easier said than done. Chapter 2, an urgent call. The most important thing that they offer to us is knowledge. They're so far ahead of us. They have already brought some of it, but it's been concealed. It has been given to some scientists, but they're most of them are remaining anonymous. This one, Dr. Edward Belbruno, has come out and talked about it. In 2018, he won the Humboldt Prize in Mathematics. He consults with NASA, works hand in hand with NASA, and is a prominent artist as well. I thought that was interesting. So this is what happened to him in 1991. He was on an isolated road in Wyoming, and it became blocked by a large object which rose into the air and flew off. And after this, his mathematical understanding and calculations exploded in complexity and sophistication and understanding, just like from one moment to the next. His exposure to this. And was there missing time? We don't know. Strieber says that there are others, and he won't name them because they're classified by the government. So should this information be classified is the question, because so much of the science and technology available and cultural significance, it's so important. Should it really be withheld from people? Top secret is for information that's disclosed that could do grave damage to national security, and he argues that it's a graver damage to not reveal this stuff. In 1947, the National Security Act was designed to keep Roswell a secret. The base where this incident in Roswell happened was the atomic bomber wing, and the fear was that Stalin was flying over it first. That was the big issue. General Arthur Exon, who was a friend of Strieber's uncle, Colonel Edward Strieber, told Whitley in 1988, quote, "Everyone from Truman on down knew that what we found was not of this world within 24 hours of our finding it." Whoa. Both were at the Air Material Command at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, where the debris and biological remains were brought for study. My uncle, Strieber's uncle, said the debris he observed had properties identical to those described by Colonel Jesse Marcel in a video he made in his later years, stating that some of the metal they found wasn't any thicker than the foil out of a package of cigarettes, but you couldn't bend it. Even a sledgehammer would bounce off of it. My uncle told me that it was subjected to bullet tests and the bullets could not penetrate it. Both my uncle and General Exon told me that they had been lawfully requested to give me the information that they did. They were not in violation of the law when they spoke to him. I do not know who might have made the request of them, nor would they tell me. So there was an intentional, directed leak about this. There's a reason that we're hearing this. Okay. The amount of secret UFO information that the government has just really increased, and the law needs to be changed because people need to know about this stuff. So why does the military keep it silent? They should say that only things that are proven to be a threat should be classified. Don't assume everything's a threat and classify everything. Why is it kept secret? Well, first of all, the visitors can't be controlled. We are militarily helpless. And, we've seen that with abductions. And as abductions increase, secrecy increase, we're just completely helpless. So what we've learned so far has been and can be weaponized. And it's a race to discover the secret to gravity as displayed by UFO behavior. Thirdly, the visitors maintain secret because we are not ready intellectually. And our ability to communicate doesn't exist. They do this, they keep it secret by manipulating culture and society. They manipulate the military. They manipulate the politicians. For example, the Roswell crash was probably not a crash, not an accident. They're speculating that it was intentional to get our attention, that it occurred 30 miles from the most sensitive nuclear facility at the time in the country, that the Army Air Force kept it a secret. Because of that, there was much confusion. It was classified because the military realized how helpless they were. And at the same time, they were trying to understand and back engineer the debris. What the visitors wanted was keeping it a secret and then improving our technology at the time. That was their goal. They didn't want us to be supplicants or slaves. They want us to be independent in ourselves. They want us to be sufficient companions to them, or we're useless. They could have invaded and enslaved us if they wanted. They could have done it in a second. They have other motives. That's not their motive. So they've spent 30 years or plus teaching someone like Whitley Strieber how to communicate. Why? Well, the message that he's been given is this, that we have overpopulated our earth and the environment is breaking down as a result. And there's been a failure of global leadership and there's a failure of social will. And what it has resulted in is us ignoring the whole reality of it. They don't want us in chaos. They don't want us freaked out. They don't want us to go extinct. They don't want the world to destroy itself or we to destroy the world. They're not altruistic. They want something from us. And the great challenge is for those who try to communicate with them to figure out what this is, figure out how to communicate with them, figure out what it is they want, and get the rewards involved for humankind. In 1985, the experience that he had overturned his understanding of the world. You could say it blew his mind. He continued a relationship with them, and after his wife died, it increased. And he believes that he was acting... Actually, I wrote that wrong. She was acting from the spirit world. And he began to see this connection between the spirit world and this visitor presence. Sometime in the early 90s, his wife, said what I believe to be the single most important thing about the experience that has ever been said. One afternoon, Anne walked out of her office after reading letters for 2 or 3 hours and stated rather quizzically, "I think this has something to do with what we call death." She said this because we were receiving a steady stream of letters involving the dead appearing along with supposed aliens. On the occasions at our cabin when the visitors came, the human dead were generally also with them. Within 2 hours of Anne's passing, she began making it clear that she still existed and was aware of this world. She did it not by contacting me, Strieber, but by asking friends to call me. The first of these, Belle Fuller, had no idea that Anne was dead when about 9:30 in the evening she heard Anne's voice in her ear say, "Tell Whitley I'm all right." So she called. And when Belle's call came, I was sitting in the living room, absolutely bereft, helplessly asking her for some sign that she still existed. Mind-blowing. So he was sure that she still existed after this and that communication with her was possible because she was communicating. The goal of religion is that death not be annihilation. And our contact with these visitors has led Strieber to believe that the separation between the living and the dead will end. That we are going to understand that that death is part of the same process as life. It's just a different manifestation of it. Empirical evidence will show us that physical life is not the only life. We'll have a new life with new freedom and opportunities for enrichment. The visitors exist mostly on a non-physical plane. The bodies that were found at Roswell, he said, were basically containers. It wasn't really the aliens. The soul is energetic. It's important to remember all living creatures have souls of some sort or other, and it's energy. And therefore, it's material, not supernatural, but it's more than just material. Science makes the mistake of rejecting that which it has not yet been able to measure. There's an energy that the relationship between us and the visitors depends on. It depends on the connection of that energy. Science denies that all that has not yet been measured because, first, the brain is made of what it can... the brain is made to see what it can use and not what's behind that. And we need instruments to show this energy so that we stop denying it. So what he's saying is that we think the brain is where it's all coming from and not questioning, is it coming into the brain? The science strategy is to reject what we can't detect. Why look for things that probably aren't there? So the visitors don't see the world the same way we do. Now, this is really an important part of this book, this explanation here. And I hope that I, in some way, can do it justice. It's complicated. They don't see the world like we do. We have what's called an output strategy. That means that our senses give us a view of the world and we see the surface. But these visitors, their reality is beneath the surface. Well, for everybody, the reality is beneath the surface. And we humans have to use instruments to detect it. Telescopes, microscopes. That's how we identify what really makes up the makeup of our world. We see an apple, but we don't see its atoms. We extrapolate everything by math. We identify a lot of things by the use of math. The visitors see math first, and they see the apple later. They think like a machine. They might even be a conscious machine. The soul is not the consciousness. It's important to remember that. Consciousness is informed awareness. Informed awareness. The soul is something else. We're all working on conscious machines. Our mind reflecting on itself. That's what basically that is. So Strieber knows that his soul is not only in his body. He has had an out-of-body experience, several. And he's been seen by others during this time and has spoken with one visitor woman and basically was told that they're able to do their appearing and disappearing and walking through walls and levitating because they can rearrange atoms. This is the holy grail of technology, he says. We could make anything into anything, completely novel materials. We could do all sorts of manifesting if we could do that. And theoretically, we can do that. We just have to figure it out. He thinks that the visitors do this naturally because that's how their mental processes work. They're coming at it from the other side. They see the world from within and can change it from within. Information in crop circles. Now, this is another. There's these little sentences in this book that are just huge concepts. The information in crop circles are fractals. They reflect geometrical principles and mathematical formulae. And it is somebody communicating who thinks in math. So they understand everything from the math first. And they're trying to deal with us, who are all about the visual, the five senses first, the externals. And that's why the person that they first were able to get anything across to a technological substance was a great mathematician. And he received this information and he knows that's where he got it. There's a fundamental communication gap. We use this output strategy to survive in our physical world. And they use an input strategy, which would give a more accurate view of reality, really. These visitors are less dense. They have fewer physical needs. They see forces and mathematics first, the underlying truth of things. They only see the form if it's necessary. Strieber believes that this is true, but he can't prove it. He just instinctively, because of his experiences, believes this is true. So there's a person alive, known about, who uses input strategy in the same way as the visitors, as described by Strieber. This guy is called Jason Duane, and in December of 2002, he took a severe beating, and when he woke up in the hospital, he no longer saw reality the way we do. He saw everything as mathematics. And he had acquired savant syndrome, which is also called mathematical synesthesia. In 2014, he wrote a book called Struck by Genius, and it's been on the Earth Files with Linda Moulton Howe. I have not yet looked it up. I intend to. The visitors tried to bridge the gap of this by showing us images, and they use natural processes to be examples of what they're trying to say. They use mathematics, they use symbols, hieroglyphics, they use crop circles. And some of these crop circles have been analyzed and are indeed elaborate fractal formulae. It's very interesting. They have to translate this deeper reality that they understand into something visual that we can understand. Communication is difficult. They're never going to just sit and chat. He says this is today rejected knowledge. We don't want to hear this. But he says, keep in mind, in 1895, Lord Kelvin rejected the notion of air travel ever being possible. Most respected scientist. The Kelvin scale, you know. The visitors, they're real, and the dead are conscious entities. And he says there's no proof yet. He can't prove it, but he'll show how he uses this, and it's opened him up to a greater world. He said his book Communion was scorned, but it revealed many who had had experiences and hadn't talked. Small people, he said. Small people, experiences of small people with large eyes and heads and, the grays. And often in accompaniment with small blue people, trolls, kind of. And often, and this is something that isn't talked about a whole lot, being accompanied by dead people who seem completely alive, like the human experiencer will recognize the dead person as somebody they know who has already died, but they look entirely alive. There's no video evidence, so you're not going to see this on YouTube. There's a couple that show strange stick figures in his website, unknowncountry.com, and then go to Out There Stick Figures. Many UFO videos exist, and his question is, are these intrusions from another reality? There's no evidence that they come from any entity or power on Earth. He thinks they're not alien in the sense of physical creatures from another planet, but they're entities with a different relationship to reality. And that's why he calls them visitors. He believes there's a higher presence behind them. And he says, without ending the secrecy, we're never going to know. We're never going to understand who we really are, what reality really is. So this all started, he said, with Akhenaten, who said the sun was God and only one God. In 1500 BC, in Persia, Zarathustra encountered a shining figure at Vanumana. And this figure taught that God was the equivalent of order and chaos. And Zarathustra tried to get people to worship the order part. Moses described the burning bush and suddenly knew how to lead his people out of Canaan. St. Paul saw the glowing orb in the sky and finally organized Christianity. Muhammad saw a glowing angel in a cave, and that ended up being Islam. And he says, in the history of humankind, light, the appearance of light, has been important to men. In 1917 in Fatima, and there's video of this, and it really is remarkable. You can see the sun moving around in the sky. 50,000 people saw it, and like I said, there's video of it. So how do we understand this? What kind of change is coming? What is this foretelling? So we're on chapter 3. How am I doing for time here? I'm going to do one more chapter. Why certain people is the question, the name of the chapter. Only certain people can communicate, and only certain people are approached. Which of those two things is true? Do you have to be a certain kind of person to have one of these experiences, or are only a few people who have them able to communicate? It seems to run in families, experiences, and some people are told they're part of the visitor's family. So, an example. Somebody wrote from Australia. In 76, I was vacationing. Oh, sorry. Let me reread that. I was vacuuming. It could be a real vacation. I was vacuuming my living room at about noon. I felt quite ill, and I thought I was going to vomit, so I sat on the couch to see if the sick feeling would subside. I then saw that I wasn't alone. There were 3 strange little people standing alongside the couch, just looking at me. 2 of them were short and fat, about 4 to 4.5 feet tall, with broad faces, enormous black eyes, with only a hint of a nose or a mouth. She goes on to say that they were wearing brown clothing and seemed to her to be workers. There was another one who was about 5 feet tall, wore a black shroud, had wispy black hair in the back of her head. Her face was very elongated, with huge, dark, piercing eyes. They demanded that she go with them, but when she resisted, there followed a sort of mental tug-of-war, which finally ended when she thought her husband came home, and it saved her. But he really did return home. 4 hours had inexplicably passed. She concludes with a statement that is also a cry from the heart of every close encounter witness Strieber had ever known. I wonder, where did the time go? So this goes on to talk about, I won't read this necessarily, but a guy who had an experience with using a laser pointer and attracting them. He said some people reach out and they invite contact, and that's that laser thing. Then he began having these visits that increased with menacing feeling. So this is the guy that attracted them with his laser at night, shining it into the sky. So be careful what you invite. One night he woke up to see a 6-foot-tall entity standing at the foot of his bed. He fired his pistol at it, causing this entity to disappear in a flash of light. So there followed a shift into a sinister haunting, elements of which, like some of the events he experienced on his runway when he was contacting them for the laser, were witnessed by other people. So one of the things that Strieber recommends is not to react violently. I mean, the next time you're encountered by a visitor, he said it's foolish to react violently. They don't have the same reality as we do. And he's saying this in the context of the military shooting at them. They can act with the physical world from the non-physical world. And when you do that, they react with animosity. They don't like it. And they actually, like the guy that shot at them, started to have progressively more strange things happen. And he said that's this anger coming from the non-physical. They see the body as a gateway to the physical. They don't see the body as themselves. So we see the death of the body as the end of this to ourselves, and it isn't. And they know it isn't. When they continue to interact from the non-physical, it's often thought to be a haunting, and it's not what's happening. It's what we describe it as, but it's an attempted communication. So this has happened to many military and to families who follow orders to be aggressive, and then they and their families get this backlash. They deal with retaliation from the non-physical, and it can even happen after you die. Souls still deal with these visitors. Robert Bigelow went on 60 Minutes and had a face-to-face confrontation with one of these visitors that he described on 60 Minutes. Two members of the To the Skies Academy, started by the rock star guy Tom DeLonge, Blink 182. They had family members who died as a result of all of this. The group wants to design weapons. Their goal is to design weapons to protect us from these entities. Well, it's ridiculous. Physical defense is meaningless. Physical defense. There is defense, but it doesn't involve weapons. We will talk about it. He talked once with an entity who was one of the blonde type, and who have advised our government on an official level. He explained, if you start a war with the Greys, they'll never let you stop fighting, and they'll never let you win. So this is what's happening right now on our official level, is they're screwing it up mightily, as, they do everything. That's not in the book. That's me, entertainment purposes, allegedly. So leaders have not been told everything that they should know, and they're not being real leaders. They're trying to do this defensive stand, and we shouldn't start a confrontation. We shouldn't be making weapons, and we shouldn't be keeping it secret. And this is what they all advocate, the leaders. So why do the visitors allow the secrecy to exist? Well, Strieber explains his progression, and he thinks this is why, because it would probably be true for everybody. He says he had great fear early on, but it finally gave way to curiosity, and they found common ground in a spiritual search. They reacted and joined his meditations. He says he has coherent, organized relationship with them. He still feels their power and their potential aggression because they're capable of controlling souls. And therefore, we're vulnerable. So I thought this was interesting. I wondered if they were connected in any way to Dolores Cannon's description of councils. So he relates to them to learn, and they relate to him to teach. They want a relationship to work. We're both smart, the visitors and humans. We're smart, and we're fierce, and we're wary. Both. Our backs are against the wall because of the planet. We're not in a good position. Either we succeed in communicating with them, or we end up with an Earth that's wrecked and nowhere for our souls to go. So Strieber believes that he has contact because older members of his family were in the military. That's how he got involved in this to begin with. Like his uncle was, involved with Roswell. They seem to follow family lines of military that they've interacted with in the past. His uncle was at Roswell. His father had some sort of weird proximity with a guy called Colonel Guy Hicks, who was a commander-in-chief of Goodman Field in Kansas, where a American pilot crashed, ostensibly chasing a UFO. And he believes his father was in military intelligence, maybe working with the FBI, because there was an FBI agent living on the same block. How weird is that? Military intelligence, military, and the FBI all on the same block. Not a company town. So his dad was very secretive, he said. Another reason for contact, besides this connection with military families, is childhood trauma. Because trauma forces a child to see things differently. They're more open to the reality of the world, maybe. They're more empathetic, hard to say. But they have higher numbers of contacts. Strieber was traumatized as a child. Now, this is really interesting. This is starting to get into conspiracy theory worldview, and I hope that you don't take it that way, because this really did happen. He was a child living on a military base, Randolph Air Force Base, in 1952, and a couple came door to door to all the military families, trying to entice them to let their children be involved in a government experiment with Skinner box isolation. He said he was very stressed out. It was very stressful for him, and as a result, it caused problems for him at school. He became terrified of his teachers, and he began to have many illnesses, and they discovered his white blood count was very, very low. He and his sister were both removed from whatever this program was. He was hospitalized in isolation and given gamma globulin to boost his white blood cell immunological system. He was kept at home until January of 1953, and then he was allowed to go to the second grade. He said his memory of all this is confused, and his sister has no memory. But one of his friends remembers the Air Force couple who did go door-to-door recruiting the kids, but that kid's parents said no because they were familiar with Skinner box isolation. They thought it was dangerous. Strieber said it was dreadful. He felt close confinement. It was dark. He heard screaming. It gave him nightmares. It was a nightmare. So 2 factors lead to potential interaction or abduction: childhood stress and trauma, or the involvement of previous family generationally. Strieber wrote a book called Secret School about the visitors in his life after he was removed from this program, and he remembers them up until puberty, and then at puberty he forgot about them. By 1985 and their reappearance, he didn't have any childhood memories left. He believes 2 things increased their contact from 1985 on: the fact that he returned to the woods and actively allowed himself to be interacted with, and these things called sensing exercises he had been doing since 1969. They had to do with kind of a form of meditation. Let me see here. Okay, I think I'm going to end here. It's really kind of in the middle of the chapter, but it's a long chapter, and I don't want to make this untenably long. So this is the end of video 1, and I'll be back with number 2 here in a second. I hope you're enjoying this. Thanks.